Welcome to the virtual book launch event for Dr. Tyrone McKinley Freeman's Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving, Black Women's Philanthropy During Jim Crow. This event is brought to you by the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy and its Mays Family Institute on Diverse Philanthropy. My name is Bob Grimm. I'm proud to be an alum of the Lilly Family School and of Indiana University. I direct the Do Good Institute, and I'm also the Levinson Family Chair in Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership at the University of Maryland's School of Public Policy. We're fortunate today to have the fabulous author of our groundbreaking book, Dr. Tyrone McKinley Freeman, here, and I'm going to give you a little more background about his new book out just today from University of Illinois Press. Dr. Freeman is an award-winning scholar and teacher. He serves as an assistant professor of philanthropic studies and director of the undergraduate studies programs at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. His work has been featured on Oprah Magazine, Time, BBC News, Newsweek, the Chronicle of Philanthropy, Black Perspectives, and the Stanford Social Innovation Review. And I'm grateful to know Tyrone. In fact, I learned the other day that about 14 years ago, I first met him when he took his first philanthropy class from me at Indiana University. Our other fabulous speaker today is Aurelia Bundles. She is the author of On Her Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, a New York Times notable book about her entrepreneurial great-great-grandmother. And the book is also the inspiration for the recent Netflix Self-Made, starring Oscar winner Octavia Spencer. Aurelia is also at work on her fifth book called The Joy Goddess of Harlem, which is about Madam Walker's daughter, Aurelia Walker. Aurelia Bundles is also a former television news executive for ABC News and NBC News. And I am also grateful to know Aurelia because 2 decades ago, she contributed to a book project I was doing when I was in graduate school at Indiana. Both of our speakers today are fabulous. The book you have to buy and share with your friends. And I'm going to have a conversation for about 50 minutes. There's a Q&A box. You can put your questions in there. And in about 50 minutes, we'll start taking your questions for Tyrone and Aurelia. But before we do that, we're fortunate to have an exclusive sneak peek at a video about Tyrone Freeman's Madam C.J. Walker Gospel of Giving. And we're excited to share with it now to give you some context before we begin our conversation.
Audio's not working.
Yeah. All right, the audio is not working, so maybe we'll.
I'm so sorry. Are you not able to hear the audio?
No.
Oh no. Okay, I don't know why that's happening. Okay, well we'll move on and go ahead to the first question, and we'll see if we're able to adjust that.
Okay.
All right, that sounds great. That sounds great. Well, let me start with my first question, Tyrone. In Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving, you wrote that the book was for all the generous church women, club women, educators, and philanthropists that have raised, taught, and loved you. Can you tell us more about why you wanted to do a book on Madam C.J. Walker and Black women's philanthropy, and how is this book personal for you?
Well, thank you very much, Bob and Alilia, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Very, very much appreciate your support, your time, and interest. So I am the son, grandson, nephew, and cousin of Baptist preachers and first ladies, and everybody else in my family who's not a preacher or first lady is a Sunday school teacher or a deacon or a trustee, very active and involved. And this is the family and the community that taught me what philanthropy is. It was a big tradition. It was part of everyday life, and but they would not dare call it philanthropy. They're more likely to just say doing the Lord's work, doing what you're supposed to do. And so I grew up in this tradition, and in fact, it produced me. So when you see me, you see that tradition because so many people poured themselves into me. And yet later, when I entered into the world of professional fundraising in my early career, I found myself in a professional space that didn't seem to value or appreciate this tradition or know what to do with it or engage it meaningfully. Fast forward later, when I enter into the academy and I'm formally studying philanthropy and I'm reading the literature widely across the field, and again, there's just not consistent, meaningful engagement with African American philanthropy, with communities of color. And yet, the reason why I knew it was because this community does it. And so really this was about bridging this gap. I knew it existed, I knew it was real, and I wanted to bring that scholarly perspective to help further make those connections and tell those stories, as well as address debates in the field, as well, and speak to everyday donors who are doing what Madam Walker is doing today, whether or not they know it, but they're part of this larger tradition.
Thanks, Tyrone. I want to ask my first question for you, Alelia. Tyrone opens his book with, I think, some pretty compelling lines. I'm just going to read them. Black, female, daughter of slaves, orphan, child laborer, widowed young mother, penniless immigrant, poor washerwoman, philanthropist. Now, Tyrone talked about how he wanted to bridge the gap in what's known about Madam Walker. And I've seen you emphasize many times that what's generally known about Madam Walker, such as being the first female self-made millionaire, or even what you saw recently in the Netflix series, are not the most important things you should know about Madam Walker. So I want to ask you, what are some of the most important things that all of us should know about Madam Walker?
So, Tyrone and I kind of joke about this competition for who's the first self-made American woman millionaire. And we both agree that that is like not the most important thing to us. It is interesting. It's an amazing achievement, but it's really what Madam Walker did with that money and the personal transformation that she made from being this daughter of formerly enslaved people on a plantation in Delta, Louisiana, who was mentored by women in the church. And I know Tyrone will talk more about that, but it is this idea of a person who first generation out of slavery saw these examples of the women in the church, saw the example of her family minister who was elected to state office, a state senator in Louisiana, and really saw that kind of Reconstruction into Jim Crow and took those lessons from the women of the church and the women in the club movement and transformed herself into a person who was a philanthropist and a patron of the arts, a political activist, and who then turned around and applied some of those same lessons to others. So she is a multidimensional woman who really embodies all of those aspirations of that generation.
Thanks, Alelia. And I've also got the good news that I think we've got the sneak peek video ready with volume. So let's give it a second try.
I'm most excited for a reader to see themselves as a part of history. Say, hey, I'm a part of this. Madam was doing this 100+ years ago. I'm doing it now. I'm part of something bigger. Black, female, daughter of enslaved parents, orphan, widowed young mother. From a penniless migrant to America's first female self-made millionaire. Against all odds, Madam C.J. Walker used her generosity to give what she could with what she had, regardless of the circumstances. along the way becoming a significant American philanthropist and foremother of Black philanthropy today. Author Tyrone Freeman sits down to discuss his new book, Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving, Black Women's Philanthropy During Jim Crow.
I wanted to tell this story to bring to life an important aspect of African American philanthropy. African Americans in particular have been very generous and have been donors and engaged in their communities from the beginning, sometimes by necessity. So it's not something that's new or something that's absent from the community, but something that's very deeply rooted. It goes back to the beginning of their experience here in America and has its roots actually in pre-colonial West Africa. And so it was important to highlight this, to add to the larger conversation about what philanthropy is, who counts as a philanthropist. Philanthropy as a human phenomenon is a big story, and this is adding another piece to that story. I grew up in a very generous family. I come from Baptist preachers and first ladies, and so growing up in the African American church, which is a philanthropic institution, has been throughout history. It's part of Madam Walker's story too. So I come from the community and experienced that philanthropy firsthand. So I knew that it existed. I knew that it was important. And at the same time, as I was formally studying philanthropy, I wasn't seeing consistent representation or engagement with the history of African American philanthropy. And so there was an opportunity there to kind of bridge that gap. And so Madam Walker was that perfect bridge. We tend to focus on the fact that she was, this business owner and very successful during the Jim Crow segregation period. And then we say, oh yeah, and also she gave to charity. Well, I was really interested in that part too. And so I was saying, what did that mean for her to give to charity? What was she trying to do? Where did it come from? She was somebody who was very much connected to helping others. And so when we tend to think about philanthropy as something that's about the surplus. You do it when you have extra time, when you have extra money. But for her, it was this fundamental aspect of her daily life. It's almost philanthropy as a way of being, giving of yourself and sharing as a way of being. And so you'll see the story unfold of how Madam Walker was involved in the anti-lynching movement, in the temperance movement, in the women's suffrage movement. She was funding and supporting schools at a time, again, when education was segregated and African Americans didn't have access to quality schools. She was supporting social services. So you get to see how a community rallied together, pooled resources together, and met its own needs because Jim Crow segregation was intentionally not meeting those needs and intentionally erecting barriers to make life difficult for them. But through their philanthropy, it's one way that they responded to that environment and met each other's needs and fought for broader change.
This book will forever change the way we understand Walker's importance and provides a much-needed context for contemporary calls for economic justice. Award-winning historian Tiffany Gill. Freeman's work opens the door for a more inclusive and more meaningful analysis so that Black philanthropy is a feature rather than a footnote of American philanthropy. Award-winning journalist, author, and Madam Walker's great-great-granddaughter, A'Lelia Bundles.
This isn't only an African American story, this is a human story. And so I think that there are things that readers from all backgrounds could gain. Because again, when you think of the idea that, you can give from what you have right now, you don't have to wait. I think that's one thing that this moment is urging people to do. Take action. There's so many issues. There's so much pain. There's so much struggle. What can you do in your circle of the world, your sphere of influence, to try to impact things? And Madam gives us a nice model to look at and draw some inspiration. Say, hey, what can I do to help move the needle a little bit in the areas where I'm living, working, playing, raising my family, those kinds of things.
At its heart, Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving, Black Women's Philanthropy During Jim Crow, tells a story about how we can give as a way of life to address important issues in our communities. Right now, who you are and what you have in this moment is sufficient to make a contribution. Purchase your copy today wherever books are sold. Also, consider sending one to the generous givers in your life. For more information, please visit gospelofgiving.com.
And in the video, Tyrone, you mentioned that often when people think about Madam Walker, they say, oh, also she gave to charity. And Aloya pointed out that often her philanthropy is a footnote. But you actually write in the book that Walker's entire life was her treatise on philanthropy. And your book's title, Gospel of Giving, is also, I think, a play on her contemporary Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, as well as a nod to her religious roots of generosity in the AME's church's role in her life. Can you talk a little bit more about what was the philosophy and lived experiences that shaped Madam Walker's Gospel of Giving, and how does her approach to philanthropy contrast with some contemporaries such as Carnegie?
Yes, thank you. And sorry on the video, I hope most people got to see it or have some sense of it, and we'll release it a little bit later, but wanted to share it here. Yeah, so the Gospel of Giving is my articulation of her philosophy of philanthropy. She did not write directly and specifically about it in the way that Carnegie left us wealth, or Julius Rosenwald left us principles of public giving, Olivia Sage left us about leisure, women of leisure. She didn't do that, but her life was her essay. And so it required me to dig in and excavate that life, to deal with her embodied and lived experiences, and to pull in methodologies from other fields that helped me to examine that, such as Black women's history. And so to follow her steps, retrace her steps, using newspaper accounts and archival records, and following the story, and look at how philanthropy is this ethos that evolves throughout her life, we see that she's doing something fundamentally different. She's not spending her life accumulating wealth and then later in old age deciding to become concerned and begin to engage. She's engaging along the way as she can. And I talk about her earliest documented gift, where she talks about being, her early migrant days in St. Louis, where she began to help others. As she was a part of that church network that Alelia mentioned. And as Alelia said, I believe it was those women there who socialized her. And in the book, I take you through how she comes out of these networks of Black women who had this ethos of giving, this generosity, whether it's washerwomen, who again, scholars like Tara Hunter and Carter G. Woodson have written about their rich philanthropic traditions, club women, church women. I mean, you can run down the line of the great historians who've done work on them. And those are what I believe are the synonyms for philanthropy in the Black community: race woman, club woman, church woman, activist, educator. And that's where you'll find this rich tradition. You may or may not find the exact words philanthropy, but you'll find these women and these men doing those things that we would think about as today as being philanthropic. And that certainly was their motivation and their intention. And then quickly, when you contrast her with the women of her era, many of the leading white women philanthropists of the era inherited their wealth from husbands, fathers, that sort of thing. So again, it's a different relationship, whereas Madam Walker didn't have anyone to inherit from. She was creating the wealth that she was actively giving away, and she was always in relationship directly with the modes of production. This wasn't about leisure for her. This was a way of life. And so it offers an important contrast for thinking about how philanthropy has evolved in our own country and become the lifeblood of this community.
Thanks, Tyrone. And Aloya, I want to ask you, you're someone who's spent decades researching and studying Madam Walker's life. I know also you've had lots of fun conversations with Tyrone about his research. And I wonder how Tyrone's book and your conversations with him has caused you to think maybe differently about Madam Walker and her philanthropy.
Well, I have to say that it is such a joy for me to have watched Tyrone become interested in this topic and then dig down and develop dimensions of Madam Walker's life that I had touched on and that he has taken to another level. And he brings this scholarly eye, this scholarly lens to this, and interrogates different aspects of Madam Walker's life as a Black woman, as a philanthropist, as a businesswoman, and really brings them together in a new way. He did a much deeper dive than I did on Madam Walker as an educator. I mentioned that she started schools, she trained women, all of that was very important, but I looked at that from a business standpoint. Tyrone really looks at it from an educator standpoint, and I loved, and he may talk a little bit about this, how he took Booker T. Washington's sort of sometimes much maligned approach to self-help and cast down your buckets, and reimagined that. And Madam Walker took it to another level with women who were urbanized. He also expanded the definition of philanthropy, and every little thing that Madam did, whether it was giving money in the Mite Missionary Society in her church in St. Louis when she was still a poor washerwoman, to baskets, Christmas baskets, but really looking at each one of those little small building blocks that developed her overall approach to philanthropy.
And I want to build off, Lily, what you said, which is expanding the definition of philanthropy. One of the things that I love about this book is the central role the Walker Company plays in talking about Madam Walker as a philanthropist, and as you said, Alelia, as an educator. In fact, Tyrone writes that the Walker Company was simultaneously commercial and philanthropic, and the hub of her gospel of giving. I'm going to start with Tyrone, with you, and then I want to have you, Alelia, add on. Can you tell us more, Tyrone, about how the Walker Company epitomized Madam Walker's gospel of giving?
Yeah, so I like to say that Madam Walker was doing social entrepreneurship 100 years before it became a buzzword in B schools, right? And this, this comes from, again, digging in and looking at the papers. Her right-hand man, Freeman B. Ransom, called it a race company. And when he said that, he means it in the spirit of racial uplift, the people identified as race men or race women. And that meant your life was in service to uplifting the race out of the scourge of Jim Crow. And so to say it's a race company, to play on another contemporary term, that means it's the original FUBU. It's for us, by us, right? That ethos of the community, like this is our own company and we're going to use this. And again, there's scholars like Juliet E.K. Walker and others who uncovered this kind of ethos amongst Black entrepreneurs of this era, where it wasn't just about profit making, it was about bringing the race along in the process. And so that's why I say her company for Madam Walker becomes the third C, if you will. The churches and the clubs were already spaces where women were doing this work. If you look at the way she used her company, she's doing very much the same thing as what the church women and the club women are doing. And so that was a very important part of this, because she didn't set up a separate foundation as some of her contemporaries. She did everything from that stage of her life through the company or as an extension of it.
Yeah, I love, Tyrone, what you say about how, people think social entrepreneurship and social innovation is a recent phenomenon, right? But Madam Walker, through the Walker agents, she's creating all these social entrepreneurs herself. The company is very social entrepreneurial itself, and she's creating a better life and a different life for all the people in her company. In fact, I think that's a really important thing for us to understand. Alelia, can you tell us a little bit more about how you see the Walker Company as one of the hubs of her kind of philanthropy or gospel of giving?
Well, sure. And so much of this really is based in the church, the Mite Missionary Society. The National Association of Colored Women met in her church in 1904 in St. Louis during the World's Fair. She was still a washerwoman, aspiring to something more. And I think the hair care products, at least for me, in some ways, I think became a means to an end. She saw that she was giving women the opportunity to be financially independent, economically independent. But she saw that while that was happening, that what their real need was for education, and their real need was to be able to educate their children, to buy real estate. So she was always planning these ideas of economic independence, along with whatever you did when you bought the products. When she organized her agents into local and state and regional clubs, and then ultimately for a national convention in 1917, she was really seeing these women as people who were going to be able to create generational wealth for their families.
I want to push this issue because I think it should cause us to think very differently about how we often talk about business and philanthropy, often think about them historically as distinct. So Tyrone, could you say just a little bit more about why we need to maybe avoid the distinction between business and philanthropy, and particularly avoided to understand the history of Black philanthropy and Black business?
Yeah, Madam Walker's operating in a very different context. Our 21st century sensibilities have us very suspicious. People are suspicious of the statements corporations are making now regarding the larger moment and wondering what's really going to change. But looking at her specific context, we have to remember, Madam Walker is achieving in spite of everything America is throwing at her. This is very important to remember, the context for Black businesses, that they're working in markets that don't want them to exist. They're working in markets that don't want them to thrive. And people are actively taking action against Black businesses. Tulsa, Oklahoma got a lot of attention this summer, right? That's part of this history where you're not supposed to be doing this. So it's a very different approach. And of course, all of this predates modern tax policy, which also further constrains our definitions of philanthropy. This wasn't about tax deductibility or what you can write off, even corporate write-offs. All that stuff comes later. So there's really this unique environment to look at and saying, how is she using, kind of every resource at her disposal almost to address this overwhelming need. Remember, the government is actively working against the Black community, actively building public policy to build and create this segregated life. The private markets are actively discriminating and intentionally locking them in to menial labor and no opportunities. And even our own beloved nonprofit sector is complicit. We kind of lay it at the feet of universities in terms of whether or not their endowments came from slavery, but the whole sector, we didn't use that word back then historically, but nonprofit organizations, associations wouldn't take in, Black children or Black elderly in some of the social service agencies, right? Schools were segregated, right? So they had to create their own. And so Madam Walker comes out of this tradition of a community trying to respond to its needs in the face of overwhelming government, market, and nonprofit focus on making life intentionally difficult for them everywhere they turn.
So Bob, if I could just—
Yeah, Lilia, please.
So the context that Tyrone has just described, where there were no safety nets, Madam Walker was so aware of that because she'd been one of those people who had been rescued in some ways by the women of the church. But at that 1917 convention, in her keynote, she said to the women, I want you to understand that as Walker agents, your first duty is to humanity. I want others to look at us and realize that we care not just about ourselves, but about others. She had this convention 2 years before Mary Kay was born. Like Mary Kay, she gave prizes to the women who sold the most products, but she also gave prizes to the women whose local Walker clubs had contributed the most to charity. She was very outspoken when there were some people, even in the Black community, who were not particularly comfortable with the push of the migration, the large numbers of migrants coming from the South. And she said, we must reach out to them. We must embrace them. So she really saw her role, just as those women of the church had seen her, to help her community.
Yeah, and I really like your emphasis that she told her agents their first responsibility is to humanity. I think further illustrates the point Tyrone is making about how the Walker Company was seamlessly philanthropic and commercial at the same time. And then something else you write, Tyrone, that I think is a great illustration of the point you were making, is you say, in many ways, the history of African-American philanthropy has been the search for hospitality in a land of hostility. And I think that's another important way for us to understand the kind of environment and the incredibly challenging racist environment that Madam Walker is working in and succeeding in. And I will have a couple more questions before we get to our audience questions. And I want to start with—
Bob, let me—
go ahead, Tyrone. You want to say something?
add to that. Yeah, that point really drives home the idea of how people responded to that moment, responded to that situation, that context, and kind of relied on self. And of course, there were allies who provided support. But again, those allies historically have gotten more attention than the community itself. And so this was an opportunity to put the community front and center and show what they were doing. But I also want to point to something larger than the context and the moment. And that's why this idea, I write about this idea of Black women's generosity, because yes, it's part of a response, but it also is an expression of human dignity and you know, and their humanity, again, in the face of something, a society that's telling them they don't have rights or they're not human. And when we think about the pre-colonial West African origins of Black philanthropy, then it becomes something that's larger than their moment crossing the Atlantic and coming into slavery and Jim Crow. It's about a larger, deeper humanity that they're plugged into there, and that they've given us access to, you know, that and try to write about in this book.
I think also that point there, Tyrone, kind of relates to the next question I want to ask, but also I think illustrates what Aulilia and you both have done, which is you've been doing work that centers people of color in the historical narrative, not part of it, centers them, and it helps us think differently about our history and the history of philanthropy, history of Black women, the history of because of that. And I want to ask a question that kind of brings us up to today, because I think this is a book that's about history, but it's as much about us yesterday as it is today, as much about who we want to be tomorrow. And one of the things you talk about in the book, I think, as well as philanthropy is about hope in many kinds of ways. And so I want to ask, like, how does the book and your work on the history of Black philanthropy and philanthropy in America kind of help us understand the Black Lives Matter movement today? And what lessons does it teach us about the fight for racial justice?
Yeah, so, you know, Madam Walker was part of the anti-lynching movement. And, you know, Lily has said before, that's kind of Black Lives Matter 1.0, if you will, right? That they're making the same kinds of arguments, because unfortunately that issue is still with us. And so she's very much involved with the leading movements of the day. And we see that tradition continuing. That's why this is, you know, Black women's generosity, that Black women in particular have taken leadership in these areas and have led the community in addressing these needs. And so today, you know, Black women founded the Black Lives Matter movement, right? 3 Black women founded the Black Philanthropy Month global celebration. Everywhere you turn, you know, that activism, that spirit of service, that spirit of generosity is still there. There are still millions of church women and club women, right, in the community doing those same kinds of things, doing vacation Bible schools and programs and services, right? This is all a part of that tradition. And again, it predated Madam, right? So it's something that she inherits, and then she therefore becomes a part of our heritage. And so trying to give voice to that continuum, I think is important. And I hope that givers and activists and educators today can stand more firmly in that history with this articulation of it, and allow it to inform how they move forward. And I hope that nonprofits and foundations and others looking to address the issues can draw inspiration on how to relate to communities, value and appreciate the tradition, not as something new and emerging, but something that's long-standing, deeply rooted, and ever present, and so much alive today.
I want to ask you the same question. How does this, as Tyrone has beautifully said, this deeply rooted, long history that helps explain today and our past, what lessons do you take from that history, given our current challenges and fight for greater racial justice?
Well, you know, Madam Walker was so clearly committed to this that she was making sure that a large portion of her bequest in her estate went to African-American organizations and individuals and colleges and schools. So she wanted to make sure that her community was being taken care of. But I will also say there were some consequences for this. Her speaking out, both but her contributions to the NAACP's anti-lynching fund, her vocal opposition to lynching and to discrimination against African Americans, both domestically and as soldiers were fighting in World War I, was met with some government opposition. She and Ida B. Wells were spied upon by a Black spy in the War Department who wrote them up in a classified document and called them Negro subversives. She tried to go with a group of Harlem leaders to the White House to present a petition to Woodrow Wilson urging him to support legislation to make lynching a federal crime. And he rebuffed them. He had supposedly was going to meet with them, and then he was unavailable. So I would just say that sometimes this philanthropy comes from her heart and from a good place, but the efforts to try to make social change, just as they sometimes now are met with opposition, were met with opposition even then, or especially then.
Especially.
And I think, I mean, and you mentioned the petition to President Wilson. You mentioned before how Madam Walker emphasized that the first responsibility of the Walker agents was to humanity. And if I can go back to that first convention she had of Walker agents, here's a quote from Madam Walker. She said in a speech to those Walker agents, "We must not let our love of our country, our patriotic loyalty, cause us to abate one whit in our protest against wrong and injustice. We should protest until the American sense of justice is so aroused that such affairs be forever impossible." Now, Walker said those words in 1917 in reference to the St. Louis riots, but I'm curious, and I think a lot of the other audience here is curious, is that if Madam Walker was alive today, how do you think she would be personally involved in the fight for racial justice? Tyrone, this isn't a topic that you exactly hit in your book, so we're going beyond your book, but I'm curious, what's your thoughts, and then I want to get Alelia's thoughts.
Oh wow, I would defer to Alelia. I mean, I think she would be in the mix. I think it's without question she would be in the mix. And I do write in the book about how that spirit and the tradition she represents is evident today in the landscape of African American philanthropy and the way in which it's structured and organized in the community, in social media, and is represented in things like the campaign for erecting the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History. So I definitely see her as being with us and a part of the zeitgeist. And I also kind of tell a little bit of how every generation has kind of picked up, since her death, every generation has picked up her story, kind of put their own twist on it and kind of propelled her forward. And I think the Netflix story is the latest iteration of that, but it goes back. Duke Ellington wrote an opera about her, Zora Neale Hurston wrote a novel about her. It just, every generation does something with her story. So we'll see what the future does. But Lilia, I defer to you.
Well, no, I think you're absolutely right. There probably would have been something named for her in the National Museum of African American History and Culture. In 1917, she was on the executive committee that helped to organize the silent protest parade in New York after the East St. Louis riot. So I'm imagining that she would have been marching, perhaps with her mask on. And I had kind of a flashback when you were asking the question with John Lewis standing on the Black Lives Matter mural on 16th Street. And I can imagine Madam Walker standing right there with the White House in the background.
Maybe, Tyrone, if I could just push a little bit more, because it is true, you have this beautiful last chapter of your book that really talks about some of the more recent philanthropic actions that we've seen. And you have this line that you use a few times that you'd say, "Madam would be smiling." If I'm quoting it right, if I'm quoting it exactly right, or around that. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of what are those practices that came from her life that would make her really smile to see other people following in the tradition and following the tradition she was also following from her life and that had been shared with her as she had lived her life from great success to great challenges early on in life?
Sure. So the Black church is still foundational to philanthropy in the African American community, and so she would be smiling at that. I mean, that is the institution that still teaches and practices giving on a regular basis. Right, it's vital, and most African American giving still goes through the church, and the church then redistributes and repurposes that for a whole range of causes that don't quite neatly fit just under the rubric of religion. Right. So that's important. When you look at the communal traditions of giving and sharing still exist. within families, neighbor looking after neighbor, people supporting each other in ways, again, that aren't captured on income tax forms or aren't done, in the formal ways that we measure and calculate, right? Those things are the lifeblood of communities. We think of high net worth African Americans, not only in sports and entertainment, but every area of achievement that, they are out there, they're making, gifts, some visibly, some not. Some of them are using and creating foundations or donor advised funds, consulting advisors, giving circles. The explosion in giving circles, right, is a big moment. It's been happening for a while now in the country, but particularly amongst Black women. So it's very special to see them. And I see this as, Madam Walker almost coming out of giving circles, if you will. That when you think about the washerwomen and the ways in which they pooled resources and supported each other and looked after each other, when you think about the fraternal order that she was in and their weekly dues structure and those sorts of things. And again, the club women, the church women, right? This is how they ran their auxiliaries and organized programs. And so that collective giving spirit is alive and well. And then there's just so many capacity building organizations, and the social media universe of African American philanthropy and Black philanthropy globally is just extraordinary. The Young Black and Giving Back Institute out of Washington, D.C., to groups like SPIN out of Denver, Colorado, and Belita Fullwood's good work down in North Carolina and nationally. There's just so many spaces where this is happening, and people are rising up and claiming it and naming it and want to change the way we think about it, because again, it's been here. It might be new to see it, but it is not new in its existence. So those are the kinds of things that I would say would have Madam smiling, because they're indications that the legacy is still alive and well, and trying to deal with the struggles that unfortunately are still here, as well as the new ones that have developed.
All right, I've got a ton of more questions I could ask, but we're going to start taking questions from the audience. And so if you've got questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and I'm going to try to get as many as we can covered in the next 30 minutes of our conversation. So the first question I'm going to ask is, someone writes, are nonprofits missing the value of Black women in philanthropy today? And I would advise to say, what kind of things are they ignoring consciously or unconsciously? So are nonprofits missing the value of Black women in philanthropy today? What's your thoughts? Tyrone, you want to start? And then Alelia, I'll see if you have some thoughts you want to share as well.
I would say yes. Again, if you are not actively engaging your Black women constituents, you're missing out on a whole bunch, because again, this tradition is alive and well. They are innovators of it, and so it's very important to recognize their presence, their engagement, and their intention. And again, I write about this as kind of an embodied generosity, which again is coming out of these disciplines that have centered Black lives, Black women's history, Africana studies. This embodied experience is very important. This is what I'm connecting folks to by bringing Madam Walker's story to the present. This embodied generosity is alive and well, and again, it's part of what is the foundation of the church, the foundation of the Divine Nine, if you will, the Black fraternities and sororities that are doing incredible works, have their own philanthropic initiatives, right? There's so many organizations and networks where these things are happening, and so if organizations are not engaging, then they're missing out. And one of the things I also caution organizations is, like, I think it behooves you to engage, because this community is not waiting. They're not waiting. National studies tell us that people of color report lower levels of being cultivated and solicited compared to white donors, right? That's a problem that fundraisers have created. We've created that in the field, and we have the power to overturn that. Whether or not we choose to is up to the field, right? But they're doing what they're doing. So you can try to become a part of it or not. And so I think that's very important to recognize the agency of this community, the values that this community has. And I would extend that more broadly to other communities of color, right? Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, all of these traditions are underserved, not recognized enough, and have a lot to contribute, are contributing, and have historically contributed to this history. So that's how I would engage that.
Alelia, would you like?
Listen, I think Tyrone has this covered. The only thing that I would add to this is there are so many people in the 3 and 4 generations younger than I who have significant roles in corporate America, in law firms, who are involved in collecting art, people who have a lot of disposable income, who have great wealth, high net worth individuals, people of color. And everybody is trying to get, that one or two shiny object person, but there are many, many other people who can offer service and expertise and who also are able to contribute.
That's great. If I could add something else before I ask the next question, because I think the question also seemed to suggest, are we missing the financial part? But I think one of the really great things about your book is emphasizing that Madam Walker's philanthropy and her impact goes well beyond the financial part. Can you say a little bit more about that? Because I think it's a really important thing for us to understand.
Sure.
Well, I mean,
I struck.
Okay.
Tyrone.
Go first this time, and then Tyrone, you go ahead.
Okay. Well, yes. I mean, she was modeling this generosity in her personal life, whether it was making sure that her employees had paid vacation, doing those kinds of things, just being generous and quietly generous as she traveled around the country, making sure that she was encouraging financial literacy among her agents. So it really did take a wide range of initiatives. She made sure that she was giving scholarships to students, to African students who were at Tuskegee. She was giving to the schools that were being run by Black women. So her philanthropy was really quite broad and quite deep.
Yeah, and I would just add that, I structured the book into 5 chapters, and each one is named for a different type of gift that she gave, and only one of them is about money. So back to this issue of definitions, right? So money is an important part of this, and it's always been a part of this tradition, but it's not the only thing. And so I cast her company and the economic opportunity she provided people as a gift, her use of her voice, again, to speak out on these issues as a gift, and also this idea that even her story is a form of inspiration to a community who is being assaulted by Jim Crow narratives about Black life, right? And so there's a different sense of possibility when you can see success and be told you could be successful compared to the other messages you're getting. So I think that's important to understand that Black philanthropy has always been versatile and had different aspects to it, but what kind of unites it is this undercurrent of generosity. And so whatever the resource is, the resource itself is less important, I think, than the fact that it's being given in trying to deal with either a personal issue or a larger structural issue. But the fact that giving it has been essential to the ways in which the community has survived and navigated their American experience.
And I would just say, in some ways, she would be considered a leadership gift in a way. That when she was giving, it wasn't just the money, it was what could you do for the organization. Even building her mansion in Irvington, New York, some people criticized her because of the extravagance, but she was doing it symbolically to show what to show what Black people had been able to do one generation out of slavery. As she said, to inspire Black boys and girls to what is possible for them.
The next question, I want to go to another one of our audience questions, and I think this is a good question, Lilia, if you're willing to talk about it. The person wrote, how do you think witnessing Reconstruction as a child impacted Madam C.J. Walker?
This is one of those, if I could go back and ask her, what she observed, that would be the question I would ask. But knowing that she was an orphan at 7 and that she gotten married at 14 to get away from a cruel brother-in-law, and that her older brothers left St. Louis. They and her family minister were actually chased out of Louisiana during the Exodusters movement by the Ku Klux Klan because her family minister, the politician, was urging people to speak up for their rights. So she had seen that political violence during the election of 1876 when the big backlash came from the political power that African Americans were beginning to develop. So she had seen what would happen with political power, and she had seen political power being taken away. When she arrived in St. Louis in 1888 as a young widow with a daughter, her brothers were barbers. That meant they had a little bit more agency and power in their community, a bit more affluence, even though they weren't wealthy, but they were leaders in their community. So those kinds of examples, I think, inspired her. She was still a poor washerwoman, but she had seen what could happen with aspiration.
And I would just add that, again, this post-Reconstruction period is a period of massive institution building by African Americans. That they are actively, from fraternal orders to schools to social services, they're building their own organizations. And it's important to remember that this is the time when the organizations that would become the bedrock of the civil rights movement in the middle of the 20th century were created, right? And Madam Walker is in the mix, giving, supporting, kind of representative of this generation that created those organizations, funded them as best they could, and kind of handed them off to the next generation. Even though they were hoping to get relief in their own generation, they enable those organizations to make it several generations down the line to wage this next level of the assault on injustice. And so it's important to think about that in that context and that continuum. She's very much a part of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the book does a nice job of talking about how she's supporting and advocating with other institution builders, and then she's an institution builder herself with the kind of educational schools and educational programs she's creating as well. And so you can see all those kind of valuable institutions that she's building. I want to hit our next questions. I want to try to get through as many questions as I can. Our next one, and I think Tyrone, I'll let you take it first, is the person writes, do you think there could be another word other than philanthropy for this way of being that you describe Walker to have? So they're asking, like, is another word more appropriate than philanthropy or not?
Yeah, this is really interesting. So this is, again, looking at the race women, the club women, the church women. These are important trails to follow to uncover this activity and these values. And I used to say that, philanthropy was not a term that resonated with the community, but other research I'm doing on the origins of the field of philanthropic studies itself and other scholarship by Black intellectuals from Madam Walker's era is causing me to challenge that, because W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about Black philanthropy. He did 2 national studies on Black philanthropy, used the term in 1898 and 1909. And so I'm digging into that and covering that. A Black woman journalist and activist named Gertrude Moselle out of Philadelphia wrote a whole essay about Ida B. Wells and other Black women, where she calls Wells and her peers philanthropists. And so it's important, and that's one of my emerging projects, is looking at this vocabulary, this language, and what people mean and how they are writing and thinking and living, again, what we would think about philanthropy and what are those appropriate terms. And then that has implications for the methodologies we use, that we bring to bear when trying to do this research. So it's important to be aware of these kinds of nuances, because that's what opens it up and makes it more visible, so it can be understood on its own terms and not always in comparison, again, to whoever the dominant mainstream folks are and what they might be doing.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an important point, that it's that nuance and that sort of creating a definition. But I do think it's really important what you have done, Tyrone, which is to center African-American giving and women's giving within this overall arc of philanthropy. It's really important to stake that claim, I think.
Yes, absolutely. And as I said, that's why there's a nice big section about reclaiming and naming Black women as philanthropists, because again, this is their heritage. And I say that, they've always been in the trenches, so why not be at the table, right? Embracing that label, and they're already doing it. They don't need me to tell them that. You can go on social media and see Black women standing up and saying, I am a philanthropist. So, I started this work 10 years ago before some of that evolved. And so I draw inspiration from it. But again, as you saw from the video, it also comes from my family. The women in my family do this, the men in my family do this. So trying to give voice to it was a big, important part of this project.
All right, great. Let me ask another question from our list here. In thinking through, this is the next question, thinking through the challenges of the times and the physical and mental strain of giving for social and political change and community uplift, how did Madam Walker both sacrifice and sustain herself through her giving? I mean, I think illustrating that we're dealing with challenging times where we also feel like we got to try to do more than ever. I mean, Madam Walker, the times she was living in, the idea of someone running a business like this and being successful was not supposed to happen. So what can we learn about how Madam Walker also sustained herself and sacrificed through the way she engaged in her philanthropy?
Well, I think Madam Walker could learn a lot from this generation in terms of self-care. She worked really, really hard, and her health suffered as a result. Her early life had been very difficult. She had hypertension. It was at a time before the drugs and the ways of caring for high blood pressure, before those things were really well known. That science, that medical science, was in its infancy. So I think she really literally worked herself to death, but she still had her people on her mind. She would have been doing meditation and getting massages. And she did travel. She enjoyed travel. She enjoyed music. She enjoyed being around her friends, being at her home in Irvington. She enjoyed gardening, but she needed some more rest. She needed some more self-care. So if she were here now, she would live another 2 decades if she was able to do that.
And I would only add to that, again, this idea of self-care, we see it today, right? The activists in Black Lives Matter movement talk about it, right? And even the women of color in philanthropy and fundraising and the Rooted Collaborative and F3 out of Atlanta, if you look at what women in fundraising who are organizing themselves and have been over the past year, and when they create their own conferences, their own retreats, they are always dealing with the whole person. Yes, there are topics on how to fundraise, but they're dealing with themselves as women, as wives, as mothers, as citizens, and they're very much talking about mind, body, and soul in that. So again, I think those things are all positive developments and need to be heralded and reproduced and be a part of these movements, because again, now medical science calls it weathering, that racism and fighting injustice biochemically, affects one's body, right? And so it's important to have self-care as a part of one's philanthropic practice.
We'll go to our next question. Please keep putting your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. The next question says, as philanthropy works to balance inclusiveness in the sector, what does the ethos of Black philanthropy mean for the expectations of Black nonprofit, Black program officers, and minority-owned foundations today?
Tyrone, that's you.
What does it mean for Black people working in the space?
Yeah.
So that's a very good question. I think that when we think about the presence of African Americans in the space, again, some of the responses, again, have been to organize. You have groups like ABFI that have been around for 50 years, Association of Black Foundation Executives that have, came together. They're increasing affinity networks, but they've always had this advocacy element, advocating for fairer grant making and distribution of resources, advocating for equity in how dollars are discussed or distributed. And again, I just mentioned how the women are organizing themselves in fundraising and bringing ethics of self-care, but also saying, open up our organizations, open up our practice. So I think that those things are important developments. I also think it may mean that there may need to be adaptations in the way that we structure campaigns and think about fundraising. The fundraising profession we've inherited, right, was really created based on the motivations and interests of high net businessmen at the turn of the 20th century, right? We know that from Scott Cutler's history and other history books about that. And so when we think about how we structure campaigns, maybe they need to be structured differently. Maybe we need to rethink the minimum amounts that we kind of arbitrarily set to make campaigns work for us and to work for, our organizations. But what if we flip that and say, can we open it up? Part of the story I tell in the book is how the Smithsonian's National Museum campaign made some adjustments in their giving levels and opened up a whole universe of donors and people who even, didn't even necessarily see themselves as givers, but they just kind of came out of the woodwork after a lot of work. So those are the kinds of things. I think that Black African Americans in the space have always felt the responsibility to advocate and that tension there. But they need help. They shouldn't be the only ones. And I hope this larger moment is challenging the rest of people of others in the organization to speak up and to be a part of this. It shouldn't only be upon the African American professionals in the space. It should be company-wide, cultural-wide, organizational-wide to adapt with and deal with these issues.
Anything?
No, Tyrone is the expert on this.
All right, let me take another question from the audience, which is, what advice can you give when trying to educate non-people of color that have an affinity to give? I think it kind of builds a little bit off of what you were saying before, Tyrone. What kind of advice can you give when trying to educate people of color that have an affinity to give?
Yeah, so one of the things I think is wonderful about this gospel of giving is that it is clearly Black women's heritage. And I'm not ashamed to say that or to write about it in that way. But because Black women have been at the forefront of so many things, right, it's instructive for all of us. It's American history, it's human history. And so this idea, and the gospel of giving, the basic idea is don't wait, right? Do what you can with what you have. And as you acquire more, give more. And that's it's pretty simple. It's foundational, right? But all of us, regardless of our race, class, background, can do that. And that's very much what I saw Madam doing, that giving from what she had at different stages of her life. And as she acquired more, giving more. Again, as opposed to waiting, spend one's life accumulating, and then give later in old age. And so I think that is instructive for all of us. All of us can think about what we have right now and what we may give. There's always someone else who's worse off and could benefit from it, but we also have things to contribute to larger movements for structural and social change as well. And so that's how I would say the gospel, Madam Walker's gospel of giving, is instructive for everyone and part of our collective American heritage, because the reality is Carnegie and Rockefeller were doing something very unique. That's a history of the 1%, and we see people now mimicking them, trying to accelerate and do more and that sort of thing. That's great. Let them, the rest of us cannot do that. Okay, but I think the rest of us can do what Madam Walker was doing, right? And we can critique philanthropy in many different ways and how it's done and that sort of thing. But I do think at its core, this model gives all of us a way to think of how we engage and how we bring ourselves into the various causes, issues, and values that we want to uphold and address.
Lloyd, I want you to say something too. But I think
I would say that, we're talking essentially about, in some ways, about financial gifts, but there are also many other ways. And I think board development is something that we have to talk about here. How diverse are boards? Just within the last few days, there were big articles in the New York Times and the Washington Post about the lack of diversity on the museum, on major art museum boards. What does that mean? And then once somebody is on the board, how are their ideas received? What is going on within the institution? So I think we really are at a moment. It's not just about the check you can write, it's about the participation you can have, the ideas that you can offer, the perspectives that you can bring.
Tyrone, actually, one of the other questions that we got in advance of the event asked, how do we get more individuals of color around the table of the nonprofit board? Just exactly what Alolia said. And you are someone who is a scholar and also has been a nonprofit professional. And so what are your thoughts about how can we get people of color more into leadership positions in boards of nonprofits and other things? What are the things we need to be doing more of?
Yeah, I think we need to deal with some of the institutional and structural barriers as well as the interpersonal ones. At a societal level, wealth inequality is a big part of this, right? And that's going to take public policy and a collective effort to deal with. That's beyond any single institution or person, but it's important to remember the larger context. But again, back within our organizations, thinking about moving beyond our homogeneous networks, expanding, engaging, inviting more people to the table is very important. Rethinking, again, minimum amounts, and being more intentional about directly recruiting and cultivating talent and engagement from these communities. And fundraisers in particular have a very important role. I have an op-ed in the October Chronicle of Philanthropy, which really lays this out and says, fundraisers can take action now because fundraisers determine who gets a phone call and who doesn't. Mm-hmm. Right, fundraisers determine who gets invited to the event and who doesn't. Who is brought to the table. They are literally, their job is to bring people to the table, right? And so, what if they start looking at it and saying, what is my organization's history of engaging people of color? What are the gaps? Where have we missed the boat? How do I begin to change that? Who can I call? Who can I invite? Whom we haven't engaged? Who's been in our donor database but maybe hasn't received attention? How can I take steps to correct that? And I think if people would do that, that as a part of their daily work, along with the larger organizational-wide cultural changes that are needed, we can begin to move the needle even more quickly. But I think about using that individual choice and opportunities when structuring our own workdays in this space and determining who gets attention and who doesn't.
I want to ask another question. Those are all really good points, and also check out that op-ed coming in the Chronicle of Philanthropy that Tyrone
Please.
has
Please.
putting out. I mean, he's writing all the time, along with the book. Very impressive. I can barely just keep up with being ready for this event. But not all of us are as impressive as others. But I got a question I want to ask you that someone put in the question box. And I'm going to ask it for you about your book on Madam Walker, and then I'm actually going to change it for you, Alelia, to ask about the book you're working on right now. Mm-hmm. So the person wrote, what's one thing, or I guess could be things, that blew your mind about Madam Walker during your book research, Tyrone? What's maybe one thing, at least, that blew your mind during your research on the Madam Walker book? And then, Alelia, I'm going to ask you, what's one thing that blew your mind as you're working on a new book on Alelia Walker, Madam Walker's daughter?
Wow, great question. Well, it blew my mind. Wow. So one thing, Madam Walker articulated a joy of giving that was pretty powerful. And again, now coming out of the church, it wasn't the first time that I've heard that idea, right? But to see it historically in documents and in interviews, and for her to really talk about the sheer joy, publicly to say it and privately. So, because one can always, say, well, is this performance or that sort of thing? But even in privately, where there's no expectation that it would ever be revealed, right? She's talking about this joy and wishing to be able, when she's writing her will, she's like, I wish I could do this now, all this stuff now. I would get so much joy out of it. Why, it's a shame it'll happen after I'm gone, right? And this is important given the moment. Like this is the scientific philanthropy movement in America, where science is being brought to bear on social issues, and this idea of needing to be rational and applying scientific method to issues is here, and people are trying to push away from charity and this idea of an emotional, impulsive responses. But here in the midst of all this, she's talking about joy. And so at the fundraising school, we talk about teaching, the gentle art, that fundraising is the gentle art of teaching the joy of giving, right? I have colleagues in the school who are doing incredible research on joy and the emotions of philanthropy. We know now that there are physiological changes that happen when one gives and one makes oneself available to help others. So to see her articulating that was just it was an interesting moment for me in the archives.
Yeah, and Tyra, if I can say something, one of the founders of the Lilly School that both of us know well, Gene Temple, I always loved that he used to say, fundraising, it's got fun in the name. So it should be fun, for the donor and the fundraiser. I mean, it's just another way to think about philanthropy is supposed to be about joy. Even when you're dealing with really challenging issues, it's also about joy. And so I think that's a really important thing for us to always keep in mind about philanthropy. And Alelia, you're working on, your new book is on Madam Walker's daughter, Alelia Walker. So what's one thing that's kind of blown your mind as you've been researching that book about Alelia Walker?
Well, just as when I started to do the research on Madam Walker, I discovered what a multi-dimensional woman she was. I have had similar discoveries about her daughter, Alelia Walker, who is much more of a philanthropist than she has been given credit for. She and F.B. Ransom actually had to make sure that they paid those bequests that Madam Walker made in her will. But she went beyond that. She was trying to carve out her own identity. She was not as much of a club woman and involved in those kinds of organizations as her mother, but she certainly made contributions to community organizations. But her real mark was on the arts in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance. It was her homes where all the artists and writers and musicians and actors came. She often hired Black musicians. She commissioned art by Black artists. she made sure that the writers had a place to come. So she hasn't really been given credit for that. And that's part of what I'm trying to do in this new book, is to show what a central figure she was. Plus, the other thing I will just say, she traveled internationally. She went to London and Paris and Rome for the coronation of the Pope. She met the Empress in Addis Ababa. She went to Cairo, to the pyramids. So she also had kind of a glamorous life as well.
All right, I want to ask another question. We're just getting close to that. I just have a few minutes left. And I was wondering if each of you to think about, is there one thing that you want to emphasize about Madam Walker that we haven't brought up yet? Or is there a point you have brought up, but you really want to emphasize it again? You think it's really important for our audience to understand about Madam Walker and Black women's philanthropy? Tyrone, you willing to take the question first?
Aurelia, why don't you go first?
Tyrone should really close this out. So I will go first because I know he's going to say something profound. But, you know, I think what I always like to say to people, it is really important to know that this Black woman coming out of this first generation of slavery established a business, employed thousands of African-American women who otherwise would have been laundresses and sharecroppers and maids, and then helped to create generational wealth. So for me, it's important that she created this company, but what's most important for me is that she left a legacy that includes people starting their own businesses, buying real estate. And then, to our mutual friend Tyrone and I, Tiffany Gill is a good friend of ours. She wrote a book called Beauty Shop Politics. And Madam Walker's legacy continued because she'd organized those women who were her agents around community service, around politics. And some of the beauticians helped to pay for the buses at the 1963 March on Washington. So I love that her legacy continues.
All right, Tyrone, now you got to answer it. I mean, I know there's no other choice.
So I would say this. So in 1952, at a graveside memorial ceremony, Walter White, the executive secretary of the NAACP, reportedly said that the NAACP survived the Great Depression because of Madam Walker's generosity. And so when we think about that idea, right, that she is supporting and engaging in the struggle, hoping for relief, hoping for social change, right, fighting for it, but she dies and doesn't live to see it. But the fact that she and her peers and her generation created these organizations, supported them, gave them life, and propelled them across the decades and over and across the Depression so that they could be positioned to wage the war of the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century and create the changes that have restructured American life over the past several decades is just extraordinary. It helps us to keep reminding ourselves that we have to play the long game too. In this moment too, there are a lot of things going on, a lot of money going to racial equity and social justice, but we have to play the long game too. I pray we will see the change in our lifetimes, but we too need to be prepared to propel all this forward so the next generation can keep it going too, but hopefully they won't have to.
And Tyrone, you talking about playing the long game, it's a great segue to a beautiful passage from your book that I wanted to read as part of closing out our fabulous session with Aurelia and you. You write that generosity is ultimately a form of hope. We give as an expression of the possibilities to which we aspire and want to make real. We give not only because the need is so overwhelmingly great, but in spite of its greatness. The hope wrapped up in each gift, no matter its size, is the hope of Daniel against Goliath. Over time, when our hope is merged and the hope of others through giving, mountains are moved and rivers are reversed. A gift by an African American during Jim Crow was an act of resistance and hope, an expression of dignity and a signal that no matter the conditions, as long as one could give, the human soul would not be crushed. Tyrone, you've given us a great gift of hope through this book, Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving. And I hope that all of you here will check out Tyrone's fabulous book, buy it for your friends, share it, check out Aurelia's fabulous books. And we at the Indiana University, Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and the University of Illinois Press for Tyrone's book So appreciate you attending this book launch event. It was my honor and pleasure to get to moderate the event with two incredible individuals who are advancing our thinking about philanthropy and helping us make the world a better place. Thank you for giving us the hope, as you said, Tyrone, to play the long game. Unless you want to say anything else last, Tyrone, because this is your book launch.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you, Bob, for helping out with this. Thank you, Alilia. You've been a companion on this journey. Very much appreciate it. Thank you to all friends, family, and associates who've joined today. Appreciate your time. Special thanks to Dean Amir Pesik, the Mays Family Institute of Philanthropy, my colleagues at IU Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and again, the families and communities and network that have produced me and supported me. Thank you very much and appreciate your time today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Tyrone. Thank you, Lily.